Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Windows on the World. Welcome to Windows on the World. Yes, I was just checking to see if people are in chat, and I was also checking to see if we had a good signal on the microphone, because we've been having a few crashes last couple of weeks. Now, tonight we're going to follow up on things that we've been talking about, and we do like to get the bigger picture on Windows on the World. And something that's talked about a lot is Kabbalah, and tonight we're going to talk about what it is, where it came from, and what it's really about. Now, if you listen to our last show, The Cult That Rules the World, we talked about Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism and Martinism, and how all these things are linked together, and where this idea of Gnosticism came from, and also how it links into Kabbalah. Kabbalah meaning tradition, which is a Jewish mystical tradition. Now, we're going to look into this whole area of Kabbalah tonight and go to the direct sources, the rabbis, the Jewish mystics, and the people who actually were pushing the whole idea of this decoding of the universe, which is basically what Kabbalah is. Now, this idea of man as a miniature universe, which is to be perfected by his own illumination, it comes really from the biblical tale of Adam and Eve and the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And there are different versions of this story. Now, in A Cult That Rules the World, we talked about what the interpretation of this means to Rosicrucians. And let's have a little quote from Freemasonry, from a Freemasonic source, which describes what this is all about. The Lucifer spirit Samael united with Eve and begat a semi-divine son, Cain. As he left Eve before the birth of the child, Cain was the son of a widow and a serpent of wisdom. The sons of Cain, who represent fire, work with the sons of Seth, who represent water, and their priestcraft is to control the sons of Abel, who are water, whom they believe through their manifesto and biblical interpretations are docile, compliant, and follow the self-appointed leadership of the Brotherhood of Cain. So this is basically a self-appointed priest class on the back of an assumption through a story. Now, if we go on to the Rosicrucians and Christian Rosenkreutz, he was given charge of the sons of Cain who seek the light of knowledge at the sacred fires of the mystic shrine. And of course, they're all really into allegory and mystery. Now it carries on. As the creative energy implanted by their divine ancestor Samael caused Cain to work out their own salvation through the fire of tribulation and fashion for themselves the golden wedding garment, which is the open sesame to the invisible world. And though the cleansing blood of Jesus is an absolute necessity to millions of weaker brothers, there can scarcely be any question when we assert that the more men and women who engage in mystic masonry to consciously build this temple of the soul, the sooner we shall see the second advent of Christ, and the stronger will be the race which he shall rule by the law of love. And what they're actually referring to here is Lucifer, and this is a Luciferian doctrine. A lot of this gets kind of mixed up, and it gets very mixed up with the New Age, and Kabbalah has become a New Age kind of candy floss term, but we're going to go into what this really means and what it's really about. Now, the Kabbalah is also a very important part of the influence of this Rosicrucianism. And its origins in the early 13th century were influential on the schools of thought which followed going into the present New Age, which has incorporated a mishmash of Gnosticism, Eastern religion, Sufism, Judaism and ancient Greek and Arabic influences, along with a front window of charlatans basically parading themselves as high priests, priestesses and shaman. Now, you can hear more about this in our show New Age of Global Governance, where we describe how these characters basically pushed all this into the 20th century. So we've got people like Madame Blavatsky and Alice Bailey, which links directly into the United Nations. And if you want to know how all that fits in together, listen to that show, New Age of Global Governance. So the origins of Kabbalah are in the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. This is basically what there is a consensus on within Kabbalistic teaching. The Old Testament is pondered over and attempts at decoding the Word of God basically resulted in a view of the universe where man could be the reflection of the whole. And through journeying along the tree of life, this Kabbalistic tree of life, you can become master of your own destiny. Now, this is where it links in to this Luciferian doctrine, basically, because what we're talking about is, are we subservient to God? Do we believe that the universe has its own unique power and we are part of it? Or do we take this other angle, which these magicians take, that we can control elements within the universe because we are the universe writ small and the universe writ large, as above so below. This is this sort of abracadabra kind of teaching, this magical teaching. So basically a lot of this is about numerology and linking to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and this is very central to these beliefs. So numerology and gematria, study of numbers, and the interpretation through the texts, especially the Bible, actually, these Bible codes, which the Kabbalists believe can be decoded through the Hebrew alphabet. Now, there's several problems with this analogy, which we're going to go into tonight, because Hebrew is not a pure language. So this is a really interesting thing. We're going to look at how Hebrew has changed and when it changed, because Kabbalah only really started in the 13th century. This is very important, and we're going to go into all that. So the origins and the changes in that language are of utmost importance when we're studying this. Now, let's go into Hebrew. The descendants of the Canaanites, known as the Phoenicians, the Canaanites became known as the Phoenicians around 1200 BC, because the Canaanites were very, very unpopular. So in order to write them out of history, they were called the Phoenicians. So Phoenicians is the new word for Canaanites, and they're generally credited with inventing the 22-letter alphabet, each representing a sound, at about 1300 BC. The Phoenician trunk of the alphabetic tree then branched out into 3 distinctive alphabetic sets. Now this is very interesting, right? So it's Greek about 1100 BC, Ancient Hebrew dates from about 900 BC, and Aramaic about the 8th century BC. So Greek preceded Hebrew, and then of course we had Aramaic, which preceded Hebrew also. So this is very, very interesting, and we're going to get into the importance of that in the next few minutes. I'm just going to see who's in chat, actually, because we've made a start. And who's there? Oh, Eric. Phew, that's a relief. Martin. Oh, are you a Martinist, Eric von Essex? Only joking, you're talking to Martin. So I'm actually very pleased with the way that the figures are going on the Spreaker platform. We're actually getting much more interest on Spreaker than on YouTube. We do quite well on YouTube, but it might not be there forever. As we know, there's been a huge clampdown on people on YouTube, so we've already had a couple of strikes there, and I'm really pleased with the way Spreaker's taken off. So tell all your friends to subscribe to us on Spreaker, and we're getting people listening to us on Spreaker all through the week, which is great. So getting back to this, now, at this point, we have to point out that the alphabet we call Hebrew today is, strictly speaking, not Hebrew at all. Now, this is incredibly important, because if you're indulging yourself in Kabbalistic beliefs and using the Hebrew alphabet, you're not using the same alphabet as you would have been doing even around the time of this Kabbalah, which goes back actually to texts of around 200 AD onwards. But we're going to get into that a bit later, because there's several texts. I've been looking through some of them, and again, very allegorical. And when you get into the scholars, the rabbis who take this apart, it becomes a real intellectual challenge to actually get into. And this is my problem with a lot of it, in that divine inspiration is usually simple. Do we need to be going down the tree of life, working out this kind of doctrine, which actually goes against a lot of the other ancient doctrines which come from ancient Greece, which influenced Kabbalah? And there's also Arabic influence in there as well. So we're going to get into all that. But about the end of the 6th century BC, the Hebrew language discarded the ancient Hebrew letters and adopted Aramaic ones. There you go, back to the beginning again, what we were saying about Aramaic. So what we've got here, Hebrew is not a pure language. So this is very centrally important to the idea of magic, because magic revolves around this idea that the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet are divine. They were God-given. Well, clearly they weren't. So this is a really important point, and a point that I've always found central to the discussion on Kabbalah. Now, with the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, most Jewish inhabitants of Israel and Judea went into exile. Among them were the best and the brightest of the intelligentsia, right? So this is again very important. So, ancient Hebrew. Now we've got to have a look at another language here which is never talked about, and it's a country that most people have been talking about for the past 7 years, and it is Syria. Now, Syria had an ancient language called Oblate, and we're going back 5,000 to 6,000 years here. And Oblate was a very accomplished language. Now, it's a cuneiform language, which was symbols, and it was like Ugarit, a Semitic language, and it was a hybrid of Canaanite Phoenician and Hebrew with Ugarit. Now, Oblate and Hebrew were closely related languages. And we have to look at this history of Ebla. Ebla goes back a very, very long way, but has been largely written out of history. Let's take a look now at some of the similarities between Oblate and Hebrew. This is a very, very important as to what we're going to be talking about. Now, let's have a look at some comparisons we can make here with Oblate and Hebrew. So the god of Ebla was Dagon, who is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible in Judges 16:23. And the lords of the Philistines gathered them together to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon their god, and rejoice, for they said, Our God hath delivered Samson our enemy into our land. Okay, so Baal and Astarte were also Oblate gods. Okay, so there we've got the Phoenician Canaanite influence, and also Hebrew through the Bible. The Oblate goddess of wine was Tirosh, which is Hebrew for wine. So Tirosh, their goddess of wine in Ebla, Syria, was the Hebrew goddess of wine, or the Hebrew word for wine. So we're looking about magic here, and magic of words. So Oblate, allegedly, had this magic written into it also, if we're going to believe that Hebrew did. Dagon was Oblate, god of grain. The Dagon was the Oblate god of grain, which is Hebrew. Dagon was Hebrew for grain. Now, Canaan, the land of Canaan, in Oblate was Canaanah. So again, very, very similar. Canaanah it was called. And Hebrew Adam is Adamu. And in Oblate, Adamu was a governor of a province in Ebla. So we're starting to get into some really interesting stuff here. Now, this is from Shabbat.org or Chabad.org, which is a prime Jewish source of literature. The roots of Jewish culture lie in a great and advanced civilizations like that of Ebla. Unfortunately, they are located in modern-day Syria, Iraq and Iran, where unprejudiced evaluation of the findings of those engaged in the work is impossible to publicly pronounce. So, the origins and the transmutation of Hebrew mean that it is not a pure and consistent language, which makes the numerology and use of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet questionable, in that they can decode the biblical text and the workings of the universe. Now, this is central to my point, and central to the point of Kabbalah. Very, very important that. So the sources for this show today are all Jewish and include the most respected Kabbalistic author Gershon Sholem and his Origins of Kabbalah. And we're going to be using that book to look into some of the literature which makes up the whole of the Kabbalistic doctrine. So the system of magical thinking also has much ancient Greek influence, and its system is not straightforward in that it contradicts its own influences. In other words, you've got Mars, which is a male planet, as a female planet when you're looking at Kabbalah. There's a lot of anomalies going on here, okay? So the system of magical thinking also has much ancient Greek influence, and we really must remember that. The analysis of the texts of the Kabbalah are laid out in great detail in Gershon Scholem's Origins of Kabbalah, the book we're going to be looking at. Now, the Origins of Kabbalah starts with this. The appearance of the Kabbalah upon the historical scene in Provence at the beginning of the 13th century, this is in France, coincides with the birth of this philosophy. So Kabbalah was born in Provence in the beginning of the 13th century. So this is very, very important because it was hugely influential to the Knights Templar, to the Gnostics, and of course later to Freemasons. Freemasonry is basically hugely Kabbalistic, and the influence of the Knights Templar was adopted into Freemason by the 1700s. And you can see that with church windows in the City of London. You can see where the Knights Templar Freemasonry came in. You can have a good look at that because it's very, very important to this whole philosophy of Gnosticism. So also worth looking at is the Albigensian Crusades against the Cathars in the Languedoc, because a lot of this Kabbalistic knowledge originated in Provence and around the Languedoc particularly. And the Cathars were actually bogomils from Bulgaria, but they were persecuted by the Catholic Church because they wanted to preach a purer doctrine. Now, there is debate as to whether Kabbalistic influence was part of Catharism, but we're not going to go into that tonight because it's far too complicated an issue, I think. So, basically, let's carry on with Gershon Sholem from the Origins of Kabbalah. Obscurantists who hated the light that shone forth from the school of the new rationalists raised against it a system they called Kabbalah, which literally means tradition. Right? So Kabbalah just means tradition, and it's based on the tradition of the Torah, and it's about the decoding of the Torah, and it gets incredibly complicated and incredibly intellectual. A lot of the Jewish intellectuals really get into the very finer points of it, and it can actually be quite interesting. But let's carry on with what he says. It's fantastic and extravagant doctrines elaborated in overheated brains were essentially superstitious and contrary to the spirit of Judaism. So that's from Gershon Sholem, and he's the expert, the chosen Jewish expert within Judaism on the Kabbalah. And that's from his book Origins of the Kabbalah. Now, as an historic phenomenon in medieval Judaism, he states, the Kabbalah was born in Provence, or more precisely in its western part known as the Languedoc. From there it was transplanted in the first quarter of the 13th century to Aragon and Castile in Spain. And this is where we get the later influence of the Jesuits. And that's another connection where we start to see this type of Gnostic doctrine being joined in to the Roman cult of Catholicism, the Universal Church. So let's have a quote now from Rabbi Emmanuel Shochet, who lived from 1935 to 2013. He states, the illumination emanating from Kabbalah ignites the soul of man, setting it on fire in the awareness of a deeper and higher reality. The thing is about a lot of this kind of allegorical language is, I think it's very, very addictive to people who like words. People love words and mystery, and intellectuals love this kind of communication, this kind of language. And it all starts to get rather too intellectual, in my opinion. I've been looking at the origins of Kabbalah and also some of the texts today. And the thing I find with it is that it's hugely complicated, in some ways contradictory. So what we're talking about here is a philosophical kind of movement which is meant to be based on the Bible. So let's have a look at that. Let's carry on with what Rabbi Emmanuel Shochet says anyway. He says, its study and insights are themselves mystical experiences. Kabbalah is all of this, but always and exclusively within the context of Torah. Again, bringing it back to the Torah. As a body cannot function without a soul, so the soul is ineffective without the body. The soul of the Torah, Nistar, the esoteric part of the Torah, can never be separated from the body of the Torah. Nigle, the exoteric parts, Halakha, the commandments and the practices prescribed by the Torah. So this is very interesting. And at what point does it actually part company with all that? And this is another point, because what we have now is basically what he's going to describe here. Kabbalah reduced to spiritual or philosophical symbolism, stripped from the observance of the mitzvahs. Mitzvah is a precept or a commandment, so basically a biblical commandment. Stripped from the observance of the mitzvahs is worthless mumbo-jumbo and an empty shell. This is coming from the rabbi there. So that's an interesting point that he's making there. In other words, if it doesn't directly go back to the Torah, then it's mumbo-jumbo, and this is where it starts to deviate off into magic and magical thinking. So Jewish mysticism differs radically from all other mystic schools. That's what he's stating. Jewish mysticism, or Kabbalah, is based on the public revelation at Sinai when the Torah was given to Israel by Moses. The historical event of Sinai attests to the divine source and nature of the Torah and Jewish mysticism. The Torah, in turn, serves as the exclusive criterion for any subsequent claims and teachings. So anything outside that is not Kabbalah. So that's really interesting. So we've got all of this kind of New Age movement that's latched onto what they call Kabbalah, which isn't Kabbalah at all. So people going around with their Deepak Chopra armbands or whatever and talking about Kabbalah, probably, in my opinion, and the opinion of these rabbis and these Jewish scholars, don't know what they're talking about. So that's really important, and that ties right into the New Age deception. So what I'm trying to do here is give an open-minded view of what this is about, because it's something I've looked into and I've started to go a lot deeper into it. It's something that's always been on the periphery of things. It's always talked about, but I think it's very important as to where we're going with Windows on the World and the sort of stuff we cover to get this out there, and that's what this is all about. So authentic Jewish mysticism is an integral part of Torah. The general term for Jewish mysticism is Kabbalah, and it just means tradition. Kabbalah is not a compound of personal insights. It is not a collection of reports of what various sages and saints had to say on the meaning of life and ultimate values based on their mystical experiences or visions. It is not a system born in a vacuum. In other words, it is reliant on the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Now, Kabbalah and its teachings, no less than Jewish law it carries on, are an integral part of the Torah. They are traced back to the historical roots of Sinai. Part and parcel of Moses received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it. Now, that's from mygewishlearning.com. So I'm using all Jewish sources tonight on the show, and we're going to primary sources like Gershon Scholem's Origin of Kabbalah, which is the go-to work for Jewish scholars to look at. Judaism has had a long and tenuous relationship with magical beliefs and practices. This is where it starts to deviate off. Lists of prohibited magic appear at various junctures throughout the Bible. For example, Deuteronomy 18:10 11. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or daughter as an offering, anyone who practices divination, a soothsayer, or an augur, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, or a medium, or a wizard, or a necromancer. Now, this is very interesting because these 18th century magicians onwards, like Eliphas Levi, MacGregor Mathers, and Aleister Crowley later, were all heavily influenced by what they're saying was Kabbalah. Well, this is where it deviates off into magic and Gnosticism and basically black magic Luciferianism. So this is where the turn-off point was with all these people like Blavatsky and her Luciferian doctrine, Alice Bailey, etc. Let's carry on with what this says now. Yet in other biblical contexts, practices that would seem to be similarly questionable, interpreting dreams, using magic staffs, reciting blessings or curses and referring to oracles, figure prominently as suitable behaviours for Israelite heroes. Moses and Aaron, for example, are celebrated for performing tricks that the Egyptian magicians could not match. Maybe this is just bragging, who knows? We just don't know. These stories are allegorical to start with, they're symbolic, and they may or may not refer to real people. And this is part of the mystery of it all. The supernatural actions of Israelites, whose source of power is God, are welcomed. The actions of outsiders, whose power comes from sorcery, are derided. Now that's really interesting, isn't it? So they're now saying that the supernatural actions of Israelites, well, who are the Israelites? The Israelites were part of Canaan. There was Canaan and the Israelites, they're saying their source of power is God. So that's a huge assumption, isn't it? So this sect is saying their sorcery is God-given, but anything else is black magic. So that's slightly dubious there, and something to be looked into. The rabbis in the Talmud make a similar distinction. They oppose some magic as the ways of the Amorites, Mishnah Shabbat 6:10, while describing other magical acts with wonder and pride. In one Talmudic story, the prestige of a sage is significantly enhanced when it becomes apparent that his Torah knowledge gave him supernatural powers that stopped a house from collapsing. That's in Yerushalayim Tanit 3:1:1. An anti-magic current in Jewish thought continued in the Middle Ages and was expressed most strongly by the great rationalist Maimonides. Though he accepted that astrology has the ability to influence human behaviour, he declared that, as well as other forms of magic, was an out-of-bounds and dangerous superstition, explicitly forbidden by Leviticus 19:26. You shall not practice augury or witchcraft. So, in other words, the Torah is absolutely insistent on this, that Kabbalah is about tradition and it's not about magic. Well, that is a big problem here as we carry on. It says, yet Jews continued to be associated with magical practices. In the Middle Ages, Christian beliefs about Jewish magic led to persecution and violence. Jews were occasionally charged with performing black magic in allegiance with Satan, and this charge made them targets of the Inquisition. Now this is interesting because once we get to the Inquisition, we're getting into the beginning of the Jesuits. That's coming up to the 15th century there. Certain Jewish customs, such as washing hands upon returning from a cemetery, aroused suspicion and provoked some bloody scenes. This even led Jews to abandon some religious practices and customs. In Provence, for example, the ritual cleansing of the public oven in preparation for Passover was neglected because it provided suspicion of sorcery. But when medieval Christians were in need of healing, Jews were regularly called upon to perform magic and miracles. Jews were generally more effective medical practitioners because of their wide knowledge of languages, the availability of Arabic, Greek medical works in Hebrew translation, and their propensity for travel and study abroad. So basically there's something interesting vein going through here, that it's stated that magic is not part of it, but there seems to be a bragging element stating that it is, and we're allowed to do it. So that's an interesting point. Paradoxically, Jews' scientific training made them superior magicians in the popular view. and every triumph of Jewish medicine enhanced Jews' reputation for sorcery. Ritual murder accusations, for example, appear to originate in the belief that Jews killed Christian children in order to use their bodies in medicinal and magical recipes. Now, this goes back to some beliefs that human beings were sacrificed with the mark of the shin. The mark of the shin was put onto victims. Now, you can look into that. It's far bigger subject to go into here. But this is where we're starting to deviate off into magic and well away from what's actually in the Torah. The belief that Jews use Christian blood for matzah baking was a later development. So this all really goes back to the idea of the Canaanites and their sacrifices. Though historians have dispelled most of the allegations of nefarious Jewish sorcery, there is ample evidence that medieval Jews considered certain magical practices to be legitimate and embraced these wholeheartedly. Around the 13th century, Kabbalah, Jewish mystical literature, split into two branches, Ayunit, which is theoretical, and Marsit, which is practical. The Kabbalah Marsit explained the mystical values of Hebrew letters and offered formulas for achieving closeness to God through meditation and name recitation, all of which might be considered examples of Jewish incantation and spells. The rich demonological literature and elaborate angelology in the Kabbalah Mashit further blurred the distinction between Jewish mysticism and Jewish magic. In all parts of the Western world, popular belief in magic has declined, and Jewish arguments against magic have been strengthened by Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinking. Now, let's get on to the books which are included, the texts which are included in the Kabbalah. I'm just going to see what's going on in chat as we go along here. Eric von Essex, religions, cults, etc. all have secrets and secret knowledge, as secrets make them look more powerful than they actually are. If you or I prance around saying we're a high priest, it automatically gives us power. Yeah, go to Glastonbury on a Saturday afternoon. Good point there, Eric von Essex, very down-to-earth point. A lot of this is about what you're just saying there. A lot of it's about perceived power. But when I started looking into this, I found that there is this belief system, this Kabbalistic system of the tree of life, the 10 Sephiroth and the 9 realms and all the rest of it. The 10 realms of the Sephiroth, actually, but we'll get into that in a bit because that in itself gets quite complicated. Yes, okay, let's carry on with this. The books of the Kabbalah are the Hechalot, the Sefer Yetzirah, which is the book of formation. Again, this is really going into Old Testament and Genesis stuff. The Bahia, the Book of Bahia, which is very short. You can download a lot of these things off the internet. The Bahia is quite a short book, again, going into mystical aspects of creation. The Sefer Ratzael, Hamalakah, the Zohar, the Pardes Rimanim, the Etz Haim, and the 8 Gates. These are the books which are basically the backbone of Kabbalistic mystical teaching. So the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of formation, written in Hebrew. Now, this really revolves around he created this universe by the 3 Sepharim, numbers, writing, and speech. Now, we're talking about a numerological idea here, which is to decode the universe in numbers and letters. And those numbers and letters are a code which, when decoded, can become power. It's all about this creation of power. Now, there's something interesting about numerology. The Hebrew system seems to be more reliable than the modern system. I don't quite know why that is, because as we've just stated, the Hebrew system, the Hebrew language is not a pure language. It doesn't go back to its roots. It cannot be traced. The real Hebrew cannot be traced to the Hebrew it is today. So it's a mutated language. However, it's based around threes and it's based around compounds of words. And yeah, how about good deeds? Well, this is interesting because there are elements which go away from that within Kabbalah, because basically Kabbalah is about perfection within the self, going through the tree of life and encountering basically all these obstacles on the way. Now, to me, it all seems a bit pointless. I've always thought, well, why not you just purify yourself and get straight to the source? this is where I have a problem with all of this stuff, and I always found the Kabbalah extremely confusing and unnecessarily complex for me. So that's a good point there, Anon 6308. So let's carry on. The Sefer Yetzirah, Book of Formation. 10 are the numbers, as are the Sephiroth, and 22 the letters. These are the foundation of all things. Of these letters, 3 are mothers, 7 are double, and 12 are simple. Little aragolical phrase there. The Zohar, Book of Splendor, was in Aramaic. Some of these books are in Aramaic. Some of them are in Hebrew, and some of them in Hebrew and Greek. Some of them in Hebrew and Aramaic. You know, these texts are not all in Hebrew. So the Zohar, Book of Splendor, that's what it means. The Book of Splendor was in Aramaic, dates from 1275, allegedly the work of Moses de Leon in Spain. So we're talking about France and Spain here as the centres of Kabbalah in the 13th century. So we're talking about numerology, Greek mythology, the as above, so below principle that man is the universe. And this goes back to the emerald tablets of Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus was the Greek god of wisdom and patron of magic. The emerald tablets were written in Phoenician, which was Canaanite, and are found in a cave tomb in the dead hand of Hermes, and discovered either by Abraham's wife Sarah or Alexander the Great, depending who you believe. Now, the Alexander the Great influence is very important because he started to manipulate Christianity in about 360. This was about the time when we got the Roman influence coming in. And so Hermes Trismegistus was allegedly also the builder of the pyramids and a grandson of Adam. Now, if he was the builder of the pyramids, he was a very clever boy indeed. So that's, good on him if he built the pyramids. A version of the emerald tablets existed in 1200, and it has also been found in Arabic. So this is interesting because this to me is a lot of the backbone of this magical thinking, and I'll tell you why that is now. Because the Latin version opens with, that which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above, to achieve the wonders of the one thing. So in other words, as above, so below is magical thinking. Man can become the universe is man in microcosm. So this is the belief of these sort of mystics and Gnostics. They were going for this route to perfection, which basically led into Luciferianism, and it's led into what we have now, which is this ridiculous New Age movement. And look how that's been manipulated into a complete Luciferian doctrine through the UN. So it's good to know the background of this stuff. Now, the belief that the universe was made of 9 spheres. Now, this is medieval. Well, it goes back a long way. I don't know exactly when this started, but we're talking about a huge influence on Kabbalah here. Yes, so Eric von Essex, generally religions are a pick and mix of various superstitions. Well, in this case, they're about a kind of inner drive for understanding. So there's a certain amount of this stuff that's all about exploration. They're trying to desperately to decode what's going on around them, but where it goes wrong is where they try and start controlling things rather than going with the flow. This is my problem with it all, is that the idea of it going into this black magic is that that's all about control and power, and it's all about your will over the will of someone else, which is not proper magic. It's not the way the universe works, in my opinion. But to me, it's like a perversion of natural law. That's the problem I have with a lot of this stuff, and I've been in great debate over the years about this stuff with many people who are into this doctrine. But yeah, the belief is that the universe was made of 9 spheres. The outer skin is God, and the first inner sphere are the stars, and inside this are the 7 spheres of the 7 planets. The innermost sphere is the moon and earth. The soul comes from God and descends through the 9 spheres to earth. It is imprisoned in a human body. And the idea is of this Kabbalistic teaching or this mysticism is that the soul wants to reunite with God by climbing back through the spheres to heaven. Now, anybody who's had an out-of-body experience will know that there's a much shorter route to it all. Basically, when you leave your body, you are that source. This is my experience of it. So I don't really go for this struggling to control demons and work with angels and get passwords to keep moving on. It's like Freemasonry. It's basically a control grid. It's a control system. Yeah. Great quote. The way the universe works, in your opinion. This is it. This is exactly it. So each sphere is guarded by angels, and there are legions of devils between Earth and the moon. Even after passing the demons, the guardians of the spheres will turn you back. Only those initiated know the passwords. Again, Freemasonry. Joachim and Boaz, these are Freemasonic passwords. You have to know the password. It's basically going back to Hiram Abiff, not giving the secret password of the temple. All of this stuff. So basically this is how this all got pushed into Freemasonry. The Kabbalah uses 10 Sephiroth instead of these 9. Okay, now that's a really important thing, and it has 22 paths on its tree of life. The 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the 22 paths on the tree of life. It coincides with the 22 major arcana cards of the tarot. However, there is great dispute amongst Jewish mystics as to whether these two things are connected. And they were connected by this guy who called himself Eliphas Levi in the late 18th century, I think. So we're talking about something that's a lot newer. So the tradition of Kabbalah does not seem to accept that the 22 paths of the tarot were related. However, when we look at where this came from, we can't say it's from one source. We can't say that it is absolutely originally Judaic. It's not. It's from a variety of sources, and that is the major point here, I think. Yeah, as Eric von Essex says, Freemason rituals are almost identical to black witchcraft. Well, they're black magic in that you're giving yourself up to another power and you're becoming beholden to another power in return for certain rewards. That's basically what you're doing. And once you become part of this secret brotherhood, then you can't really get out of it. So it's not like becoming a part of a club, going, well, I'm going to leave. I'm not going to, I'm not going to renew my membership. You can't really do that. It's stated by Freemasons that you can, but if you look at it as a cult, it's pretty impossible, I would say. Now, the 22 Hebrew letters are associated with the 22 works of creation in Genesis. They contain all knowledge and wisdom. There are 333 ways to be deceived along its paths. How tedious is that? Now, this is an interesting thing because I've had real-life psychic attacks with this energy. I've seen entities on people. I know that these things exist, but there are much easier and simpler ways of explaining this stuff that make a lot more sense to me than this. This seems to be the invention of overactive imaginations, as that rabbi was saying in his own words at the very beginning of the show. Gershon Scholem, the absolute quoted expert on the Kabbalah, said that it's basically the product of overheated brains. And that's, I think, one of the most profound things you could say about it. Because I've been looked into this stuff for such a long time. That is exactly my view of it. Let's carry on with this. These spirits are aspects of the self or delusions. They are both inside and outside the experiencer. Now, what this is all about is that, in other words, the whole experience is being generated from yourself. And in order to become perfect, you have to overcome all these things. Well, is it really this complicated? This is my question. The expectations meet belief along the way, and the whole thing is prone to delusion as to what is real and what is not. Now, this goes exactly into the summoning of demons, spirits, seances. That absolutely defines what that's about. Expectations meet belief along the way, and the whole thing is prone to delusion. Because people are interpreting it according to their beliefs. They're putting their beliefs onto it. So in other words, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you go down this Kabbalistic tree of life, encountering all these things, then it's in your own mind. Does it exist outside your mind? Well, no, it doesn't actually. It's their way of trying to decode the universe. Well, I don't think it does. That's my personal opinion, and I would like to hear more from people who know more about this than myself. But having looked at it, these are my conclusions. Now, based on the soul's descent and ascent through the spheres, because the Kabbalists were influenced by Pythagorean theory, the Earth is the last Sephira, the last Sephiroth. Then 7 Sephiroth of the 7 planets, and Sephiroth of the sphere of stars, and the first is God, the prime mover. So God is the centre of it all. The Kabbalist wants to ascend through the spheres while still alive and make himself as God on earth. Now, there's a huge problem with this. As you can see, the Kabbalist wants to ascend through the spheres while still alive and make himself God on earth. What could possibly go wrong? What sort of person is he going to become? You know, Kabbalah, the search for God. To attain magical power of God, the Kabbalistic tree of life is a model of the universe. It has 3 triangles and 10 sephira. Now, the triangles are the way we make our way through life. The 10 sephira, there's a model of God, the universe, and man. That's what this Kabbalistic tree of life is. The tree does not fit perfectly, and it is sometimes at odds with both astrology and numerology. Saturn, Mars, and Mercury are classed as female. Now, that goes against everything that we actually know from ancient literature. So, and it's in Kabbalah, Venus is male, which is very interesting, because then we get the Shekinah, which is meant to be female, which is the explosion of male energy and female coming together, I think. I mean, this stuff all gets very allegorical when they talk about it. If you read these books like Origins of the Kabbalah, you will find that it goes into real off the wall, in my opinion, intellectualism about it. It's quite interesting, but it's a bit mind-blowing. So Eric said, it is said black magic was used during World War II. Before the Pentagon was built, everything went in Germany's favour. As soon as the Pentagon was finished, everything went against Germany. Roosevelt was a Freemason and gave exact details of how the Pentagon should be built. This is all very interesting stuff, and let's say it's what they believe. None of this is what I believe, it's what they believe. So that's a very important point. It's what they believe. This is not what I believe. And I am at odds with a lot of these teachings, but I'm actually in concurrence with their general belief that this original Kabbalistic teaching was about the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And as these rabbis say, anything outside that is not Kabbalah. So will someone pop over to Portugal and tell Madonna that, please? So the Torah, Jewish experts state in the Torah that all Kabbalah is based on the Torah. Now let's get into the Zohar, which is the Book of Light. The Zohar was kept hidden for 900 years, this is the legend, between the 2nd and the 11th centuries CE, Common Era. Since those who possessed its wisdom understood that at the time people did not need it and would misunderstand its contents. Again, this is very much like the Rosicrucian myth. You can see where they're getting their ideas from, can't you? Now, only in the 16th century did a Kabbalist arise who explained the fundamentals of Kabbalah, the holy Ari Rabbi Isaac Luria, 1534 to 1572. The Ari stated that from his time on, the wisdom of Kabbalah was ready to be opened to everyone. Well, that was good of him, wasn't it? Containing the doctrines of the Kabbalah together with the discourse and teachings of its author, the great Kabbalist Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai. Okay, so let's have a look at the section 1, Genesis, creation, in this book, the Zohar. When the primal vibration of the divine word took place, it produced and impressed a wave-like motion throughout the boundless ether in which were contained all the sounds of the alphabet from A to TH. Okay, so this is talking about the Hebrew alphabet. So they're saying that the Hebrew alphabet came through the boundless ether, and the boundless ether contained all the sounds of this Hebrew alphabet. This operation and effect is symbolized by the union of these 2 letters from forming the word Ath, ATH, as it is found written Ath Ha Shayemanim, the heavens. Shemayim, the heavens, actually. It's Shamayim. Thus, Brashith Bara Alhim Ath Hashemayim signify he, the unknown mysterious one, created Alhim, Alhim, the fructifying and generative principle of the heavens, one in origin but dual in operation. Hence it is seen that the divine word and essence, designated by the word Asher, is found between the fecundative and generative principles, both of which are symbolized by the same name, Ahih, in the divine appellation Ahih, Asher, Ahih, and of course Yvyh is God. So they're saying that this Hebrew alphabet is basically divine. It came out of the ether and it was there to decode the world. Well, we've already proved that that isn't the case, unfortunately. The Zohar, or brightness, also denotes the generative essence and includes all the letters taken as types and forms of creatures and things in its operation. Such also is the significance of the verse, Jehovah our God is one Jehovah. That's in Deuteronomy. One Jehovah, containing three names expressive of the three graduations of the divine essence as exhibited in the three first words of Genesis, Brashith, Balm, Alhim, Ath, Hashemayim. Brashith specifies the mysterious divine being, Bara, the mystery of creation, Alhim, the mystery of preservation, Ath, Hashemayim, the fructifying and generative principles considered as one. If to the word Ath be added H from the following word, Hashemayim, the heavens, we get the prominent term Athath, thou, Alhim, the divine being to which the scripture alludes. God, that was hard work. So this stuff gets very, very, very complicated. Now, Kabbalah thus constitutes a phenomenon of Jewish life in the Christian Occident. We possess no historical information or direct testimony to its existence or propagation in the lands of Islam. Now, there is an Arabic influence going on here, which crossed over into the Languedoc and Provence in France. It's very, very interesting, all this stuff. And of course, then we get into the Knights Templars. So whatever we know about the earliest Kabbalists and their circles comes from the Languedoc. It is in the cities Lunel, Narbonne, Pasquares, and perhaps also in Toulouse, Marseille and Aries that we find the first personalities known as the Kabbalists. Their disciples then transplanted the Kabbalist tradition to Spain, where it took root in such localities as Burgos, Girona and Toledo, and whence it spread to other Jewish communities. The historian of religion is entitled to consider the mysticism of the Merkabah, which was pre-Kabbalah. It was this learning that was pre-Kabbalah, the Merkabah, to be one of the Jewish branches of Gnosticism. However rare the references in the extant text to Gnostic myths or abstract speculation on the eons and their mutual relations, certain fundamental characteristics of Gnosticism are nevertheless fully congruent with the kind of mysticism we find in the Merkabah writings. This is the Rabbi Gershon Scholem again. The possession of a knowledge that cannot be acquired by ordinary intellectual means, but only by way of a revelation and mystical illumination. So the thing is about all this is that when you get these insights, they're magical. It seems to me that this is a struggle where you're involving lots of different things that you don't need to. To me, it's highly complicated, even though it is kind of interesting. This is my view of it. Maybe I'm not indoctrinated enough into it, though. Some people I've met have been absolutely convinced of all this stuff. It's never convinced me. I'm much more with people like Emanuel Swedenborg and looking into things in realms, and there are different levels of vibration. These things make sense to me. Even though these things aren't alien to Kabbalah, they don't form a central part of it. The central teaching of Gnosticism consists of methodological instructions for the ascent of the soul from the earth through the spheres of the hostile planet angels and rulers of the cosmos to its divine home. The fact remains that precisely these ideas were affirmed in the heart of an esoteric discipline within the Jewish tradition, and not only among Jewish heretics. Now this is interesting because this is where they're getting called heretics. So people who are veering off in Judaism are here called heretics, even though the role of the pagan planet angels is here assumed by other archons or rulers. These archons threaten the ecstatic visionary at the gates of the seven celestial palaces, and entirely in keeping with the doctrines of various Gnostic writings of the same period, can only be overcome and compelled to admit him to pass by the display of magic seal through the recitation of hymns and prayers, etc. So this is all magic words, again, back to numerology and back to the divination through the Hebrew language. These 22 paths of the Sophia or the Sephiroth are the 10 primordial numbers and the 22 consonants of the Hebrew alphabet. So it goes into Greek again, back to 10, as elements and building blocks of the cosmos. The paths of the Sophia are thus fundamental forces that emanate from her or in which she manifests herself. They are, as in the old conception of the Sophia herself, the instructions of creation. The 10 primordial numbers are called Sephiroth, a Hebrew noun newly formed here that bears no relation to the Greek word sphera, but is derived from a Hebrew verb meaning to count. Among the three realms, there exist precise correlations which no doubt also expresses relations of sympathy. The 22 consonants are divided into three groups. The first contains the three matrices, Aleph, M and Shin. These in turn correspond to the three elements deduced in the first chapter in connection with the Sephiroth, ether, water, fire, and from these all the rest came into being. Now, I'm really into the idea of ether, and indeed so were the Victorians. I think the ether which is behind everything, in other words, a unified field, really does resonate with me and makes absolute sense when I've had the experiences that I've had. Okay, you can say they're subjective, but they concur with other experiences. I'm very much into this idea of the parapsychologists because, to me, they're decoding reality in a much simpler way, but in a more scientific way, and they're doing it by actual exploration and through controlled experiment. And that to me is highly important, and it gets us away from this mystical idea. Now, I'm going to be carrying on with this in future shows because I think it's absolutely fascinating, and there are elements in Kabbalah that are really interesting, and I've got a lot more to get through, but I'm going to do this show tonight as 1 hour long because I think this is such hard going. We're going to look at the Book of Bahia, and basically this is all about the creation, and it's basically these are discussions. These books, they're actually discussions about reality. So in that respect, they're very, very interesting, and when we look at them, we find stuff that is obviously coming from different sources. That's my view. So I hope people have found that interesting, and we are going to carry on with this. An hour going into this stuff is very little time. It's very complicated, and I'm going to be doing more explorations into it. But I think we've sort of got into the actual idea of what this is about, and I hope people can apply that to other things. What I want to do with these shows is try and strip things down to their barest essentials, what they actually are. What are we really talking about here? So I'd like to go more into these books at future dates, and also how they tie in to what's happening now, because this is part of the bigger picture. The reason I'm going into this stuff is because it's still hugely influential, and it's influential with people who are actually assuming that they run the show. When we look at the use of numerology in terrorist events, etc., whether these people are just imitating this stuff or whether they actually believe that these numbers have power are a separate issue. Whether it's by imitation or by design, it doesn't really matter because they've set up the system. So that's an interesting point. I would say that the Hebrew alphabet is very interesting. However, it's not pure in its essence, and we've talked about the Oblate language, which is another language which has huge influence on Hebrew and also has huge magical connotations. So we're opening a very big chest here, and I hope that people find it interesting. I'm going to be going back through some of these passages and looking into these books over the next few weeks and seeing how they tie into the much, much bigger picture. So that's it for tonight's show. And I'd just like to thank everyone for listening, and we'll see you very soon on Windows on the World. Please do look at us on Spreaker, subscribe to us on Spreaker, And if you feel generous, please donate to us because we have a lot of expenses. That's it from Windows Towers for this week. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next Sunday, 9 o'clock on Windows on the World.